Hello, my name is Ruth Fortis, and today we're going to talk about performance assessments. So, what is a performance assessment? A performance assessment is a task given to a student that requires that student to produce something in English. Okay, that something can range from a one-word answer to a question to a 60-minute documentary movie. So the important thing to remember is that we're not talking about a task where they have to select the right answer on a multiple choice test, but we're talking about something that requires the student's active production of language in some form, whether it's spoken, written, or both. So, what are some examples of performance assessment tasks? Journals, student newspaper, oral presentations, group projects, student-constructed quizzes, videos, portfolios, all summaries, all of these things are things that students have to produce, and they can be considered performance assessment tasks. So, why is it a good idea to use these kind of tasks? Okay, well, first of all, a performance assessment uses real-world, uses real-world context and simulations. And this is in contrast to, let's say, a standard paper and pencil test, which is kind of an artificial situation. In the real world, when we're out there communicating in a foreign language, we have conversations, we have interactions, we give talks, we listen, but we don't usually in the real world, outside of school, don't take tests. Okay, so a performance assessment is something that simulates a real-world context. Okay, it allows students to demonstrate what they know in ways that are similar to the way information is used in the larger world. It revolves around the purposes for learning a language and the language performance necessary to meet those purposes. Again, if the point of language is to enable communication, then that's what you get in a performance assessment. You assess the student's ability to communicate in a foreign language. It involves students in constructing various products for diverse audiences, and it taps into higher level thinking and problem-solving skills. Now, my personal opinion is that a good multiple choice test can also tap into higher level thinking and problem-solving skills, but it's also certainly something that a performance assessment task can do. So let's just quickly go over some characteristics of a performance-based task. Unlike, let's say, a multiple choice question, there is no one right answer. The student can give an opinion, and there can be a variety of opinions or a variety of ways to present a particular topic. It can be integrative. It can combine different skills, both speaking and writing, for example. It encourages divergent thinking. There's a focus both on product, but also on process. Okay, for example, if someone writes a series of drafts of an essay, then each of those drafts is part of a process, and they can learn from that as well. It's not a one-shot, sit down, let's answer the test and go home. A performance-based task promotes independent learning. It involves planning, revising, and summation. It builds on pupils' prior experience. It can definitely include opportunities for peer interaction and collaborative learning. It enables self-assessment and reflection. It can be, when properly done, interesting, challenging, and authentic. And, this is a very important point, it requires time to complete. Now, the time may be anything from 1 hour to 3 months, but you need to bear this in mind when you're planning the use of performance-based task that it does need time. Now, there are many ready-made activities and tasks out there. There is no need to reinvent the wheel. And here is a link to an ECOSTAR site where you can find classroom activity exemplars that are CEFR linked and can give you some kind of idea. And they include also tasks that can be done in the classroom and for homework. So I strongly recommend that you if you haven't visited there already, you take a look. But if you, if you, in any case, you want to make your own tailor-made task, then the next slides are going to show you how to do that on your own. Now, before we continue, please make sure you've looked at the sample performance task for the upper intermediate level. It's just underneath this PowerPoint file in the PDP program. It's called, it's a letter to Bill Bryson, and from now on we're going to call it the Bryson task. And as we go through the slides, we're going to characterize the Bryson task on each of the dimensions. So that's why it's important that you at least be familiar with it. If you want to, you can even print it out and have it next to you, but that's not absolutely essential. Okay, so there are 4 basic components of a performance assessment task, okay? And this is taken from an article by Richard Stiggins, which you can find in the recommended reading folder of this particular unit, okay? So the reasons are, the components, are, first, you want to clarify the reasons for the assessment. Why on earth are you doing this in the first place? You want to clarify the performance to be evaluated. What do you want to, what kind of performance are you looking for? A speaking performance, a writing performance, both. You want to design particular exercises which will elicit the performance you want to look at. And you want to design the performance rating plan so that you can assess the performance on the exercises. So the first thing we're going to look at is a number of slides related to the reasons for the assessment. Now, usually you give an assessment to obtain information about the student in order to make a decision, okay? So why you're doing the assessment can be thought about in terms of the decision that you've been asked to make or that you need to make. One decision could be, for example, if you're wondering if the student has maybe some learning disabilities or other issues, then you can administer a diagnostic test or a diagnostic performance assessment task in order to identify the strengths and weaknesses in the performance of individuals. Now, it's true that you can see strengths and weaknesses in almost any assessment, but what is meant by a diagnostic test is really a more in-depth test or assessment. It's longer, it could take a few hours, and it's always one-on-one, and that allows you to probe deeply and get a lot of information. Okay, usually not what you use in a standard classroom. Progress, mastery, and grading. In 99% of the cases, an EFL teacher is going to administer a performance assessment task for this purpose. Okay, you want to know how well the students have progressed in the material you've been giving them. Have they mastered particular skills? And you want to be able to give them a grade, whether it's on a particular task or a midterm grade or a final summative grade for the course. Okay, so that's usually the reason teachers give performance assessments. Sometimes you want to place or group students. You want to assign examinees to specific instructional groupings within a class, or sometimes you want to, ahead of time, place them in the appropriate class. For example, the AMIR test, the AMIRAM test are placement tests. Selection tests, entrance tasks, readiness assessments. These are in order to identify individuals that are either far behind or far ahead of the rest of the group for placement into special advanced programs or perhaps remedial programs. For example, the OFIC programs in grade school, they only take the top 3% of students in the country to participate. So you give a test that allows you to identify who are the top 3%. Sometimes, I know in Japan, they have readiness tests for first grade, and if you don't pass the tests, then you may not be able to get into what is considered a good first grade class. So those are basically different types of selection tests, and they're usually norm reference tests that compare someone with the rest of the relevant group. In other words, they're not interested in how much absolutely the student knows or doesn't know, but they want to know, are they better or worse than the group we're talking about? Certification tasks are usually there to verify the mastery of specific skills by individuals, and there's usually a certain minimum that people have to know. Okay, the bar exam for lawyers, tests that nurses take, licensure tests actually are a good example of certification tests. And sometimes you want to talk about program evaluation. You want to determine if a particular program of instruction has worked effectively or perhaps might need revision. But we're going to focus, as I said before, on the second point, which is progress mastery. Okay, the next point you need to clarify is the decision maker. Who is going to be making the decision? In our case, and in everything that's relevant to you, you probably are going to be the one making the decision. In the Bryson test, you're the one that's going to be rating it and assigning a grade. However, sometimes you can have more than one person involved in making the decision. Okay, what use are you going to make? What are you going to do with the results from the assessment? Sometimes you want to rank examinees. I mentioned that just previously in relation to selection tests. Sometimes you just want to see how many people are doing better than most of the class, how many kids are doing not so well, and you're not, or for some reason you need to rank them, let's say in order from the lowest to the highest. This is not so common in academic English courses. In academic English courses, what's usually done is to determine mastery, and that's called criterion reference scoring. Okay, the Bryson task is a task that determines how much a particular student has mastered skills or material that's been taught. When you rank examinees, it's crucial who's with you in the group. Okay, you could be really smart, but if you're in a group with geniuses, then you may be in the middle of the ranking. Whereas when you determine mastery, in theory at least, every single student in the class could get 100%, okay, on a test. It doesn't matter who you're taking the assessment with. It's looking at the individual independent of other people. And sometimes you might want to do a combination of ranking and mastery. In other words, you could rank order students and then look at the skills which were not mastered by the people who scored low. But that's less common. And finally, when you're creating a performance assessment task, you need to think about who are the students that you're going to be assessing. Okay, you have to think about the number of examinees in your class. And why is this important? Because, for example, if you want them to give a presentation, an oral presentation on something, it would be really nice if each of them could talk for 15 minutes and then you could get a really, really good idea of what they know how to do orally. But who has time in class? If you've got 20 or 30 students, you can't allocate 15 minutes of class time to each of them. So you may need to limit it to 3 minutes per student or 5 minutes per student. But in any case, part of what you need to take into account is how many people you're dealing with. You also have to think about their proficiency level. Okay, for example, the Bryson task was addressed to students at the upper intermediate, otherwise known as מתקדמים ב' level. And that, of course, has bearing on the kind of things you can ask them to do. And there might be other salient characteristics of your group of examinees. For example, you might have a lot of Arab students whose English is their third or even fourth language. You could have a lot of new immigrants. You could have a lot of learning disabled students. All of these factors will affect what you can ask them to do in the performance assessment task, okay? Okay, here, up till now, we have been talking about the reasons for the performance assessment, and now we're going to move on to the second component, which is to clarify the performance to be evaluated. What kind of performance do you want to elicit from your students? And this slide deals with specifying the focus of the assessment. The focus is composed of two things, the content domain and the skill focus. Now, in many EAP courses, there's no specific subject matter. You might be teaching students in the Faculty of the Humanities or the Faculty of the Social Sciences, so you might stick to text or topic that's relevant to the faculty as a whole, but often that can be a wide range of subject matter. In some cases, you might be teaching particular students. You might be teaching law students, you might be teaching engineering students, and in this case, you might be able to specify a particular content domain. Okay, if you're teaching law students, there's going to be legal terminology. There might be particular phrasings that are used in a legal context. Your texts will most likely be about legal issues and so on and so forth. So specify the content of what it is you want to assess if you can, and if not, just leave that as a general, just leave that pretty open. The skill focus, on the other hand, is always needs to be specified. When you're working within a CEFR framework, the skills, the abilities you're being tested are very, very closely tied to the can-do statements that you're working with. And if you look at the Bryson task, at the end of the task, you'll see there are 7 can-do statements for the upper intermediate level, which the Bryson task is geared to assess. Okay, there's the ability to understand articles and reports, the ability to convey information, the level of vocabulary that's expected, of grammatical accuracy, and so on and so forth. You can go and look at that. You're going to be focusing on these skills in the task. Okay, so for any performance task you create, you need to have a list of the abilities that you want to test you. The performance is geared so that you can See whether the students are able to do what they're supposed to be able to do at this point. The next thing you want to think about is you want to decide on the type of performance. Do you want to have a process? Do you want to have a product? Or do you want to have both? Okay. An example of process is, for example, if a student gets up in class and talks and the teacher assesses their speaking fluency. Okay. How does speech flow? That's process par excellence. You can't capture it unless you can videotape that, of course. But it's something that it's sort of you can't really redo your fluency without giving a second presentation. Okay? It's a little bit ephemeral. Or you can focus on a product, which in the case of the Bryson task is a written email that the students have to write to Mr. Bryson. Or they can produce a poster. That's also a product. In most of the cases, you will probably be dealing with products created by the students. The question you need to ask yourself is where and what type of performance can you find the best evidence of proficiency, and how can the students best exhibit their ability? Now, this slide relates to the actual rating of the product or the process. I'm going to go over this briefly now, but Unit 3 will go into how you rate a performance in much, much greater depth. So now we're just going to touch on it briefly, and then we'll go through it more in Unit 3. So when you create a rubric to assess a performance, the first thing you have to do is state the dimensions of examinee performance that reflect the important skills which are the focus of instruction. Okay? Not only do you have to state these dimensions, you have to define them, which is the most crucial part. You have to create a rating scale, and you have to provide standards for performance along the scale. Okay? A good way to look at creating a rubric is imagine that you're in the position of giving feedback, okay, to a student who has done really, really poorly on this assessment. Okay? What factors are you likely to mention to the student if you want to give them feedback on how to improve? What are you going to tell them? You have to work on A, you have to work on B, you have to work on C. If you think of it that way, then A, B, and C are likely to be closely connected to the dimensions that are important in your task. Okay? Now, defining the dimensions is probably the one most single important thing you're going to do in a rubric. If you don't have a clear sense of the key dimensions of a good performance, you can neither teach students how to perform well or evaluate their performance. So this is the part that demands a lot of thinking on your part. Okay, what are the elements of performance that you want to focus on? But we'll come back to this in more detail later. Okay, so the next thing we're going to do is design exercises. Okay, what form are these exercises going to take? Are you going to observe everyday events occurring naturally? Or are you going to design structured standard exercises? Now, again, in 90% of the cases, 99% of the cases, you're going to be designing a structured standard exercise that gives the students instructions or describes events that will lead to their performance. And the Bryson task is an example of one such structured standard exercise. But you could have a discussion, let's say in class, on a certain topic, and you could observe how the students speak, address each other, the student may be writing an email to you for clarification, you can observe how well they phrase their question, if they do it in English and not in Hebrew, of course. So that too is a form of assessment, even if it's not for purposes of grading, but you can get a lot of information just by looking and listening to your students. Okay, the information doesn't only have to come from tests, quizzes, and other assignments. Okay. You need to also determine the obtrusiveness of the assessment, and this is kind of related to what I just said before about whether you observe everyday events or design exercises. If part of your grade, let's say, that you give to the students is observing them in class, okay, in that case, they would be unaware of the assessment. The advantage of that is that you eliminate the anxiety that you get when students know they're being assessed. And you get a typical performance because they don't know they're being assessed. They're not making a huge effort to be really, really good. You're getting what they typically do. If they're aware of the assessment, which again is what happens in most cases, then they are motivated to do their best work. But anxiety kicks in. Now, a little bit of anxiety is not such a bad thing, but debilitating anxiety may prevent the demonstration of skills that you know exist. Okay, so again, most of the time students are aware of the assessment. Sometimes you may want to do it unobtrusively, but you have to be aware of student privacy rights. Okay, just bear that in mind. How much evidence do you need before you can, for example, give an end-of-year grade? Well, different degrees of evidence gathering can be either one sample gathered at one time, okay, which is the Bryson task. Give the assignment, they do it or they don't do it, and that's it. Sometimes you have multiple samples gathered at one time. For example, you could have a day of testing. Again, in academia, it's not that usual, but at some testing centers, someone might go through, for example, when they do the IELTS test, okay, they have a reading comprehension section, they have a listening section, they have a writing section, there's an oral section, there's a lot of samples, usually gathered all at the same time. You could have multiple samples gathered over time. Okay, for example, portfolio is very often a collection of works done over the course of a year. Okay, when you decide what you want to, what type of, how much evidence you think you require, you have to think about the importance of the decision. Okay, the more important, the more high stakes the decision, the more evidence you need. In order to make, you want to have as many samples of performance as possible to make a reliable assessment. The samples you have should be representative. In other words, you don't want only speaking samples because on the day of the writing assignment the student was sick. So you have to make sure your samples give you a representative picture of that student. And of course, how much time you have available to gather all this evidence, which is usually not as much as you would like. There are no rules about how much is enough. You have to use your judgment to what you think is appropriate. Okay, now we're moving on to the last component, which is to design the performance rating plan. And again, some of these will be repeated in Unit 3, but I want to talk about some of them right now. What type of score do you need? You can get a score by doing holistic rating, okay, where all the dimensions, remember we talked about in slide 2C, we talked about the dimensions, the important elements of the task. When you rate holistically, you look at the whole performance altogether. You give a holistic rating. Holistic rating is less time-consuming and less expensive. In other words, if you're paying raters to rate performance assessment tasks, this is a cheaper way and a quicker way of doing it. Or you can do analytical rating, which is what is going on in the Bryson task, where you have the dimension and you don't look at them all together. You look at each dimension separately, and you give a grade or rating for each dimension separately. So this might take a little bit longer, but it gives you diagnostic information. Okay, you can see where the students' strengths lie and where their weaknesses lie. You also have to decide who is going to rate the performance. Again, in most cases, it's going to be the teacher who's doing that. Sometimes there might be other professional people involved. There could be cases of self-evaluation. In the Bryson task, there's a little bit of self-evaluation. They have a checklist. So their job before they hand it in to you is to go over their email and go down the checklist and make sure to evaluate it themselves to make sure they have everything there that needs to be there. Okay. Anytime you give students a performance assessment task, they have to be provided with the rubric. Now, it may not be identical to the rubric you're doing, but it has to be something, some form of rubric or some checklist, so it is clear to them what are the criteria according to which they are going to be graded. Okay? You can't spring this on them after the fact. They have to know ahead of time what are the dimensions, what are the important points you're going to be looking at, and preferably they should also know how many points are attached to each element that you're going to be rating. Okay? When they have this information ahead of time, it helps them reflect on their product and it helps them improve it. Okay, not just it helps them also not to forget particular parts, but actually you could even build the rubric together with the students and talk to them about what they think is important and what is worthwhile grading and what is not worthwhile grading. But that's already a pedagogical decision, and I'll leave that up to you. Another aspect of who is going to rate the performance is that you should use teachers or professionals if rating requires specialized knowledge or technical experience that only a professional possesses. If the decision to be made requires standard uniform test conditions and unbiased ratings. And you want to use a professional if examinees may benefit unfairly from self-evaluation or from peer evaluation. And in most classrooms, the last point applies. In other words, the grade hangs in the balance. So you're not going to usually you're not going to let the students give themselves the grade. You can use self-rating or peer rating if examinees are capable of learning and applying the performance criteria. At university level, college level, they should definitely be able to do that. If slight variation from rater to rater is acceptable in the context, in other words, if it's not a really high-stakes situation, and if examinees have got nothing to gain from artificially inflating or deflating their ratings. When should you use more than one rater? Again, if it's a high-stakes kind of decision that needs to be made. Agreement between raters. Let's say two teachers rate each performance assessment task. So agreement between raters indicates that the criteria have been dependably applied and that rater bias has been controlled. And disagreement indicates either that the criteria need to be considered, or they were not clearly stated, or the raters need to be better trained. In Unit 3, we're going to talk more about agreement between raters, so I'm gonna stop here and go on to the next slide, which is also about raters. Okay, I'm going to just finish up here. So everybody needs to be trained, whether the raters are experts or students. You train raters by practicing with the criteria on samples of performance. And by the way, training students to rate is an excellent instructional strategy. It makes them think about what they're doing. It makes them focus on the important elements of the task. And you should try that sometime. It's very useful. Thank you for your attention. On the Moodle site, on the website, you will now find a quiz on performance tasks. If you like, you can do the quiz and see if there's anything that may still not be clear to you. Hope you will find everything clear. If not, you can always contact the moderator and we'll help you out. Bye for now.